Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Private Well 101 webinar. My name is Yilin Zhuang, the Water Resources Regional Specialized Agent in UF IFAS Extension Central District. Today, my partner, the Water Resources Regional Specialized Agent in the Northwest District, Dr. Andrea Appleton, will teach this webinar with me. This webinar is part of an extension program called the Florida Well Owner Network. If you have not heard of extension before, you may wonder what extension is. Extension is a partnership between state, federal, and county governments to provide science-based, research-based knowledge to the public. There is at least one extension office in each county. I am the regional specialized agent in Central District, which covers 11 counties in Central and North Central Florida. It is highlighted in orange on the map. Dr. Appleton is the regional specialized agent in the Northwest District, which is highlighted in yellow. There are a total of 5 districts in the UF IFAS extension. As I mentioned earlier, this webinar is part of the Florida Well Owner Network. What is Florida Well Owner Network? Florida Well Owner Network is an extension program that aims to educate residents about well water quality and quantity, the best practices to ensure well maintenance and groundwater protection, to facilitate access to well water testing and provide information about treatment options if problems are found, to complement the efforts by the Florida Department of Health and the Florida Department of Environmental Protection to increase awareness among Floridians about best practices regarding wells, septic systems, and drinking water quality. Why did we develop the Florida Well Owner Network? Let's first look at the private well situation in Florida. An estimated 2.5 million Floridians rely on private wells for home consumption. This translates to about 12% of the state population. Different from public water supply, private well users control the management and protection of their well water. US EPA safe drinking water regulations do not apply to residential private wells. Private wells in Florida are under the purview of the Florida Department of Health. They usually issue permits for new construction and repair, as well as provide information to well users. In some parts of Florida, water management districts issue the permit. Florida Department of Health has a program called the Well Surveillance Program. It identifies and monitors threat to the drinking water supply, ensures that contaminated sites posing the greatest risk get cleaned up first, and prevents long-term consumption of contaminated drinking water. These threats are usually man-made contaminants such as pesticide, like EDB. Very limited public data exists on how many well users regularly test their water or drink from contaminated wells. On the other side, private well users are usually septic system users. Nearly 1 in 3 households in Florida depends on septic systems for their household wastewater disposal. It is estimated more than 2.5 million septic systems are in use across the state of Florida. The Basin Management Action Plans identify septic systems as a major source of nitrogen to many impaired water bodies. There is a need to educate private well and the septic system users about best management and maintenance practices and groundwater protection. In this webinar, Dr. Appleton will give an overview of where our water comes from, the basic components of a private well. Then I will talk about what can contaminate the well water, what we should test, and where we can get it tested.
Hi, everyone. As Yilin mentioned, I'm Andrea Albertin, the Regional Water Resources Extension Agent for the Florida Panhandle. And now in this part of the webinar, let's look at where a lot of private well water comes from in the state of Florida. Much of our drinking water in Florida comes from the Floridan aquifer system. Aquifers are underground layers of rock that can hold and transmit water. Water can be held in porous rock like limestone, which is what the Floridan aquifer system is largely made of. Water can also be held and transmitted in loose materials like sand, silt, or clay. And water can also be held and moved through rock fissures or cracks like you would find in solid bedrock. So the Floridan aquifer is one of the most productive aquifer systems in the world, and it is made up of a thick sequence of carbonate rock. So we have a lot of limestone, calcium carbonate, and it's also made up of dolomite, which is a calcium and magnesium carbonate. The Floridan aquifer encompasses a huge area of about 100,000 square miles, reaches into Georgia and South Carolina to the north of us, and Alabama to the west. In Florida, it supplies drinking water to about 11 million people. Now, although the Floridan aquifer does extend throughout Florida, in many areas it's too deep to access, and the water in the deepest portions is high in salts and is not potable. In these areas, aquifers that lay on top of the Floridan aquifer are used for drinking water. This happens, for example, in the Western Panhandle, and wells there draw water from a sand and gravel aquifer that lies above the Floridan. This here is a map that shows aquifers at the land surface. So what do we have at the surface? As you can see, the Floridan aquifer system is marked in blue, and in several areas of the state, it comes right to the surface. This is also where most of our spring systems are found. This is where limestone is right at that surface. In areas where the Floridan aquifer is too deep to access and is unpotable, as I mentioned in the previous slide, wells do tap into aquifers that lie above the Floridan. For example, if you look at the Western Panhandle, wells draw water from the sand and gravel aquifer, which can be more than 400 feet deep in certain areas. In Southeast Florida, another example, well water is drawn from the Biscayne aquifer. It's important to remember that water chemistry does vary in each aquifer. As I mentioned before, the Floridan is composed of limestone and dolomite, so that we have a lot of dissolved calcium and magnesium in the water. This water tends to be hard. You can see that white scale in pots after water is boiled. pH is high, it's not acidic at all. Whereas water in the sand and gravel aquifer in the Western Panhandle, for example, has different chemistry, tends to be much more acidic, it has lower pH, and it is softer water. This is an aquifer diagram. You can see the whole system here, and you can actually see not only the Floridan down below, but two systems that lie directly above it. The surficial aquifer system right at the surface, and there is also an intermediate aquifer system right here in the corner of the diagram that I want to draw your attention to. There are wells at different depths tapping into these three aquifers. That's depicted here over on your right-hand side. Wells that access water below a confining unit, which is marked here in that orange peach color, wells that go below or in one of these confining units tend to have better water quality than wells in a surficial aquifer. A confining unit is a layer of rock or soil, like hard-packed clays, that keep water from flowing through them freely. So water below that confining unit is more immediately protected from activities at the land surface that might contaminate water. So deeper wells, again, that are tapped into areas below a confining unit tend to have better water quality than surficial shallow wells. The Florida Department of Health created the Florida Water Management Inventory Project, and this is a data map that identifies drinking water source for land parcels in Florida. They identify either public supply or private domestic wells, as well as each parcel's wastewater treatment method. So whether it's on a central sewer system or has an on-site septic system. In this map, known and likely wells are identified in dark and light purple land parcels, respectively. Now, Dr. Zhuang Yilin had mentioned in the beginning of the talk that more than 2.5 million Floridians depend on private wells for water consumption. And you can see here on this map that wells are distributed throughout the entire state, largely in rural areas. Although it's important to remember that we still have some wells in urban areas. Public supply tends to be concentrated in urban areas, and you can see a lot of that in our major cities in blue. Now let's move on to the next section of the webinar, which is just going over what are the basic components of water wells. This is a slide that depicts or shows you a schematic diagram of a well in the landscape. It is definitely not drawn to scale. The well itself is much larger than the house, but this is a good one simply because it can show you basic components of a well. And in this case, although it says there's a minimum setback distance requirement between your private well and your septic system, in Florida, that setback distance is actually 75 feet. So let's look at each of these components separately. A water well casing is there to maintain an open access into the earth. It doesn't allow any entrance or leakage into the well, and it's usually made of non-toxic and durable materials like black steel, galvanized steel, PVC, and concrete pipe. It's good practice for it to extend at least 12 inches above the land surface. This helps prevent any leakage of floodwaters into the well, particularly if you don't have a good seal on your well. Next component of a well is a screen, and a screen helps keep sand and gravel out of a well while still allowing groundwater to enter. It's found at the bottom of a casing. Popular materials for screens are stainless steel and slotted PVC pipe. A screen is used when wells are drilled into unconsolidated materials or loose materials like sands. In Florida, though, there are many wells that don't have a screen. They're drilled into that solid limestone and don't need one. Next very important component that helps maintain your well water clean is a grout. Now, grout is a sealant, and it's used to fill in the pore spaces or the spaces around the outside of the well, so between the drilled hole or the borehole and the casing. Grout protects a well against the intrusion of contaminants from the surface. And the one pictured here has this well has an additional cement pad on top of that grout seal, which just adds added protection to your water. Grout can be made of either cement, bentonite, or concrete. Another very important component in ensuring and maintaining water quality in your well is a well cap or a sanitary well cap. This is a watertight seal, and it prevents contamination from flowing down into the inside of the well casing. Caps are usually made of aluminum or a thermoplastic, a hard plastic. And again, it's very good practice to keep the well cap at least 12 inches above the ground or flood level, just to ensure that you don't have any leakage if you don't have a properly sealed cap down into your well water. The Penn State University has excellent information about well caps, and the link here provided is to more additional information on well caps. Now, many well caps will also have a screened vent on the cap. The vent screen is made of wire mesh. The purpose of the vent is to equalize the air pressure inside the well with that of the atmosphere. So another important point from this picture to look at is that you should really not have much vegetation around the well. Debris can get into or onto the screen, and this can produce bacteria. It can be a breeding ground for bacteria. So a good practice is to ensure that you have no vegetation surrounding your wellhead. In terms of well development, after drilling, a contractor will remove excess grout, silt, or clay left over from the drilling operation. New drinking water wells must be disinfected to ensure that the water is safe for drinking as soon as the disinfectant is flushed. Typically, household non-scented bleach is used for disinfecting a well. So are there any water testing requirements for new drilled drinking wells? State law does not require newly drilled drinking wells to be tested. However, testing may be required by a lender for mortgage purposes. Also, some local jurisdictions do require that newly constructed or repaired drinking water wells be tested. So typically, coliform bacteria is required to be tested, although some additional contaminants may be required depending on the location, your local conditions. So the best practice is to contact your local health department to see if there are any specific requirements regarding newly drilled wells. Although we said that residents are responsible for ensuring the safety of their drinking water, which is true, the Florida Department of Health, together with the Florida Department of Environmental Protection, does administer a well surveillance program in areas of known or suspected contaminants. So in these identified areas, wells are sampled and tested for contaminants of concern. Residents in areas of known contaminants will either be connected to public water supply, if that is possible, or filtration systems, for example, may be provided or installed by the state to remove some of these known contaminants. More information about these delineated areas can be found on these two links provided here. Now, it's very important when you're drilling a well to consider the water table. So if you construct a well during a high water level period and stop drilling when you reach water, the well may not be deep enough to produce during low water levels or during dry periods, especially if inadequate pumping equipment has been installed. Water levels can vary more than 40 feet, depending on where you are between wet and dry years. So if you construct a well during a high water level period, there may not be any access to water during the dry years or even during seasonal fluctuations. Low pressure cutoff switches are recommended on pumps to prevent pump damage. But how does a homeowner know how deep their well is? This goes to obtaining, you have to go back to obtain the well record. If you build a well, the contractor is required to deliver a copy of the record to the owner. But if you don't have one, then the Department of Health, water management districts are where you would start your search. Just keep in mind, this may require a lot of legal work. Please keep in mind that this may involve a lot of legwork, especially if you have an older well. Newly drilled wells do have a number which make them easier to track down. This would be on a metal plate put on the well where basic well information is listed. At this point, I'm going to hand the presentation back to Elin.
Thank you, Andrea. Now let's look at what can contaminate your well water. Generally speaking, the source of potential contaminants are within the following categories. Inside your house, such as lead from plumbing and fixtures. Outside your house, for example, your septic system might be a source of contaminating your private well water. Another category can be naturally occurring contaminants, such as arsenic. So if it's like deep in the aquifer, they are just natural occurring there. And it also can be contaminants caused by human activities, Again, it could be your septic system or your land use activities, such as fertilizers and pesticides. So what should you have your well water tested for? Drinking water supplied by municipal water system is monitored for many contaminants, as authorized by the 1974 Safe Drinking Water Act and its amendments. The U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, US EPA, has established its limit on the concentration of certain drinking water contaminants allowed in the public water systems. These limits are set to protect your health and ensure that your water is of good quality. The Florida Department of Environmental Protection has accepted the national standards. As I mentioned earlier, private well users are responsible for the management of their own private wells. So in other words, private wells are usually not required to test their drinking water to meet primary drinking water standards. However, you can use the public drinking water standards as guidelines when you're evaluating the quality of your drinking water. There are two categories of drinking water standards. Primary standards, the orange box on your left, and the secondary standards, which is the gray box on your right hand. Primary standards protect public health by limiting the levels of contaminants in drinking water. They are legally enforceable standards that apply to public water systems. Secondary standards regulate contaminants that cause offensive taste, odor, or color, or sometimes can be foaming or staining in drinking water. They are not enforced because they are not considered to pose a risk to human health at the recommended level. We have a publication about drinking water standards. You can find the link in the end of this presentation. So from the list showing you the previous slide, you can see it's like nearly 19 contaminants regulated by primary drinking water standard. So it's not necessary, not possible to test all these contaminators. So what are some basic water testing parameters? Florida Department of Health recommends testing your private well water annually for coliform bacteria, nitrate, lead, and pH. These tests should be also done or conducted after repairing or replacing an old wells or pipes, or even you just install a new pump. While these are common threats to your drinking water, like shown here, coliform bacteria, nitrate, lead, your well water may also have the potential to be exposed to other contaminants. So you can contact your local health department to find out what contaminants may be common in your area. Now you know what you need to have your water tested. Then the next question is where you can have your water tested. Private well users are suggested to test their drinking water by a certified lab. You can find a list of certified water testing laboratories on the Florida Department of Health website. We have included a direct link in the end of this presentation. The question that we are often asked is that if we can use these testing kits. These kits claim that they are able to detect common drinking water contaminants, including nitrate, nitrite, copper, lead, bacteria, and pesticides. We find these three highly rated drinking water testing kits and then compare their results with a certified testing lab. Here is what we found. The bottom line is that these testing kits are not accurate or sensitive enough for the contaminants regulated by primary drinking water standards. These primary drinking water standards regulated contaminants pose health risks. So we still suggest using a certified lab to have your household drinking water tested. So how often do you need to test your water? And an annual water testing is recommended, but you also want to test your water more than once a year if the following situations rise. Someone in your household is pregnant or nursing. There are unexplained illness in your household, or your neighbors find a dangerous contaminant in their water. You note a change in water taste, odor, color, or clarity. You have a spill of chemicals or fuels in or near your well. So if these situations happen, you want to test it right after the situation arises. Different contaminants have different sampling procedures. For example, samples for coliform bacterial testing must be collected using sterile containers and under sterile conditions. Lab testing asks you to collect samples first thing in the morning after water has been confined in the pipe overnight. Before you have your water tested, you need to have an idea what potential contaminant you want to test or you are looking for. Here we have a quick checklist. It gives you a guideline what might cause your water problems or what you might want to test. First is visibility. If you see scale or scum, so they made from calcium or magnesium in the water. If your water is unclear or the turbidity is high, then it might be from dirt or some clay, silt, or rust in water. If you see green stains on the faucet, probably it's high acidity. And if you see brown red stains on the sink or your dishwasher or sometimes even clothes, so that might be caused by elevated dissolved iron in your well water. And sometimes your water looks very cloudy, but if you let it sit there, it will clear up. Then it might be just because it might be it's the pump or some problem with your filter. So now let's look at the checklist from the taste perspective. So if your water tastes salty or some like brackish taste, then it might be high sodium content in your water. So if it has some soapy taste, might be the alkaline minerals in your water. Metallic taste might from the high iron content, also might be high acidity. If you have if you discover any like chemical taste, it might be from industrial chemicals or pesticide. And the last on the checklist is smell. So if you smell rotten egg, so it could be the dissolved hydrogen sulfide gas. And also it depends if it's only from your hot water, so it might be your hot water. So you can try to flush out your water heater for once or twice, because the first time you flush it, you may still have sediments in the bottom, which may require you to flush it again. So you can try to flush your water heater, see if the smell goes away. Sometimes the smell is from both hot water and cold water, then it's highly likely from the source. And if you smell detergent, so it might be from a more functional septic system. And if you smell gasoline or you smell oil. So it might be it's the fuel is seeping from a tank into the water supply. And the last on the list is methane. If you smell methane, so might be it's decaying organic matters in water. And the last one here doesn't apply to everyone because if you smell chlorine and you know you have a chlorination tank or disinfection tank with chlorine in it, so that probably is just too much chlorine in your disinfection tank. But like I said, not all the private well systems have the chlorination tank. So generally speaking, our groundwater doesn't contain chlorine, and you shouldn't smell chlorine. So here are the checklists from different, like from odor, from visibility, from visual, and from smell, just help you to identify what may cause your water problems. And here is the links to the resources that we mentioned during the presentations. With that, we thank you for your time. If you have any questions, please do not hesitate to reach out to us. Thank you.